Are you dreading increasingly shorter days and longer nights? Do cold, overcast northwest winters bum you out? You may be suffering from the big dark, but there is a solution. I'm Dyer Oxley, telling you to talk to your podcast app about Meet Me Here, KUOW's arts podcast, a weekly dose of events and culture to lighten up your life. Side effects of Meet Me Here include laughter, curiosity, and inspiration. Find Meet Me Here on your local KUOW app or wherever you get your podcast.
Seattle and Austin, Texas have a lot in common. We've got Amazon, they've got Dell. We have Bumbershoot, and they have South by Southwest. Both have their signature foods.
Crispy bacon, fluffy eggs, a warm, freshly made tortilla. I'm here in Austin, Texas. I'm here to eat breakfast tacos.
So I got a lukewarm, extra caffeinated, decaf, dairy-free coffee with milk. Exactly.
But one thing Austin does not share with Seattle right now is our rising housing costs. This is Booming. I'm Joshua McNichols. Austin is not a cheap place, but for the last few years, it's been a real outlier. While many cities saw rent go up, Austin's average rent actually fell a lot. So today, what is Austin doing right? And what could Seattle learn from it? That's coming up.
How would you feel about relocating to Austin?
Well, look, I'll be honest. The real reason I agreed to come out here is because I've always wanted to check out South by Southwest.
Austin's economy looks a lot like Seattle. A lot of people move there for tech jobs, and usually that drives up rents. That's what happened in Greater Seattle. The average cost to rent an apartment here has risen by 5% since 2022. But in the Greater Austin area, rents have dropped steadily for 3 straight years. 6% in 2023, 4% in 2024 and 2025. So how did Austin do it? I called someone who has lived in Austin for a long time and is deeply familiar with the city's housing and growth to find out. Audrey McGlinchey. Audrey, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey. So I'm currently on leave, but typically I work as the housing reporter at KUT, the NPR station in Austin, and I've lived there for a decade and have covered the city's growth and housing for years.
I kind of think of us as doing the same job in different cities.
Yes, reporting twins. I love it.
Yeah. Okay, I'd love for you to tell me sort of big picture. How did Austin manage to do this when so many other cities have struggled with rising rents?
Yeah, so we could start this explanation at various points in time, but I'll start with the pandemic. During the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, 2020, 2021, rents in Austin are actually going up at some of the fastest rates across the country. We're seeing rents go up 20%, 25% year over year, which is an incredible increase. So what really happened is builders in the area saw all this demand for housing. There were tens of thousands of people moving to Austin because they could suddenly work remotely, or they just wanted to, live in a new city, maybe with better weather. And so all these people are moving to Austin, rents are going up, and builders are looking around saying there's a lot of money to be made. So they start getting projects in place. They start the long process often of building tens of thousands of new apartments in the city. Building an apartment takes several years, and so a lot of these apartments started opening 2024, 2025, and we really saw one of the largest building booms in Austin's recent history. And with this increase in all these new apartments and the city's population rise has really slowed. The same amount of people that were moving during the pandemic are no longer moving to Austin. So with less demand for housing and a ton of more supply, we've just seen rents go down, like you said, over the past 3 years.
So all these new homes that were built in Austin, who are they built for?
Yeah, well, we're talking about private housing, which is what most people live in, meaning it's a private landlord. You're not, your landlord's not a nonprofit or the government. And new private housing is always going to be more expensive than older housing. And so, this was typically for maybe a tech worker, someone coming from an upper class background. Just these are places that have a pool. They might have a gym inside. They might have all these amenities that an older building would not have. But at the same time, we know from a lot of research that's been done that building these new, more expensive buildings does bring down rent for these older buildings, right? The idea is that people who can afford to will move out of these older, cheaper buildings into the newer, more expensive buildings, kind of making room for people to move in and perhaps avail themselves of cheaper rent. But at the same time that builders in the city are building all these new, amenity-filled apartment buildings, we've also seen in Austin a big increase in low-income housing, or housing that's set aside for low-income people. There was a policy change that the city made in 2019 that really just made it easier for nonprofit affordable housing builders to build this kind of housing, and they say it really has made a difference.
So how have people reacted to all that housing? I know in Seattle, people see this more expensive housing come in and they think that it's responsible for all the price rises that they're seeing. You mentioned there are some that are more affordable, but a lot of it's more expensive. So what kind of reactions did you hear in Austin?
I think it's really mixed. Absolutely, people who see new housing going up and, there goes the neighborhood, right? My rent's going to go up now. Now there's going to be a fancy new coffee shop that's not for me. And I think that's an absolutely fair reaction to have. Austin, like many cities across the country, has been a city of an immense change over the past couple of decades. There are neighborhoods that are unrecognizable from just 2010, for example. But I think at the same time, I've also talked to people who have benefited from these new apartments, and the way in which they benefited is that they've been able to find more affordable rent. I'll just share, I have a friend who actually, when he went to re-sign his lease, his landlord offered him cheaper rent without him having to ask for it. Yeah, and I've heard that from several other people. It's pretty incredible. I mean, I had never heard of something like that until this past year or two. I think for many renters, that's something they have not seen in Austin for so long, and it's exciting, right? Who doesn't want to, be able to save $100 or $200 more each month?
Yeah. So what I'm hearing about is sort of like a classic supply and demand situation where there was heavy demand. So builders started building a lot more supply, and then the demand slowed a little bit because fewer people were coming to Austin. And so prices went down because the supply outstripped the demand in some ways at that point. But I've heard there's more to Austin's story than that. I've also heard that Austin has made it easier to build housing than Seattle has. Before this interview, I spoke with housing economist Jenny Schutz. She wrote this book called Fixer Upper: How to Repair America's Broken Housing System. And Audrey, I want to play you a clip of what Jenny said to see what you think.
Austin really stands out among big cities as one of the cities that has built the most amount of housing, that consistently is trying to make it faster and easier to build lots of different types of housing across the entire city. That's very different from what we see in a lot of the big expensive coastal cities, where there's sort of a fear of growing too much too fast, and where the elected officials are typically sort of working around the edges, but often making it harder to build rather than easier to build.
Okay, Audrey, so does that description match anything that you've seen in Austin?
Absolutely. We've had a real political transformation in the city in that over the past 4 years, we've just had new people elected to city council that really ran on a campaign of making changes to building regulations, to zoning regulations.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of this big national debate going on right now about whether cities, like Seattle, for example, are slowing themselves down. Ezra Klein uses bagels to explain this. He's a New York Times columnist, and Jenny applied his analogy to our two cities.
Seattle has tended to be an everything bagel kind of place. So they may want to pass pro-housing reforms, but also it wants to have tenant protections and inclusionary zoning and things on top of that may limit the effectiveness of the supply-oriented policies. Texas is a good example of just a plain bagel. You want to increase supply, you're going to pass a law that increases supply without any frills on top.
Okay, so let's talk about that very plain bagel. Tell me about how much Texas and Austin have stripped down regulations on builders and how much you think that may have contributed to the big boom in housing that we saw there.
Yeah, so we've seen a loosening of building regulations both at the city level and at the state level. And I think across the country, we've seen more state legislatures become involved in this debate, where historically they just have not been. So I'll start with the city. In the city, like I mentioned, there was this political transformation that took place about 4 years ago, where voters just elected more people who ran on the solution to the housing affordability crisis is to build more. And so over the past couple of years, the city council has loosened regulations. For example, the city of Austin no longer has parking minimum requirements. So builders don't have to build a minimum number of parking spots when they build an apartment building, for example. Another example is in neighborhoods in Austin where historically you could only build one house on a piece of land. You can now build up to 3. And these are pretty big changes. Many of the city's zoning regulations have been in place since the mid-20th century. And so I will say, though, these changes are relatively new, and I think the building boom we've seen more recently that has brought rents down is really the market just doing what the market does, and that builders see demand and they build a bunch of new apartments. And I think some of these regulations may have helped them build faster, but I would not say that this rental drop is because of these changes. I think these changes were really centered on single family neighborhoods, and we're really seeing just a boom in large apartment buildings going up.
Yeah, we've seen some of those rule changes here too in Seattle. We haven't really seen the apartments being built under those new rules yet because interest rates went up and it kind of slowed down construction.
Yeah, and I'll just add here too that we've seen the building boom in Austin really slow. Part of that is interest rates. Part of that is because we're not seeing the population increase that we historically have seen over the past 2 decades. Fewer people are moving to the city. And so there is less money to be made for, large apartment owners. And so we had this huge boom in 2022, 2023, and that's really, really declined. So there will be a lot fewer new apartments opening, I think, in the next couple of years. Okay, so Joshua, you mentioned this analogy about bagels. And so I'm curious, given what Texas and Austin have done, what extra toppings does Seattle put on its housing regulations?
Well, there's several things that builders say make housing more expensive here. But the biggest one is an environmental rule that protects farms and forests outside the city. It's called the urban growth boundary. And it's basically this big red line around metro regions in Washington like Greater Seattle. Outside that line, it's much harder to build. All the growth is supposed to be channeled inside that growth boundary. And this forces Seattle to build up rather than out into sprawling new suburban developments. So we have to squish together. That boundary is a big reason why people love this area, though they may not know it. But on the other hand, we failed to build enough housing within that urban boundary to meet demand. There's a lot of reasons why. There's some hoops that builders have to jump through and fees they have to pay. And all these things slow down the production of housing and make it more expensive.
Yeah. And I know here in Austin, builders always complain to me about the permit process. I think that's something that the cities may have in common. It just takes a really long time to get things sort of moving.
Another difference between the two cities could be that Austin is just bigger in terms of its square footage. You've got more room to put new apartment buildings than Seattle does.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Austin's about 4 times the geographic size of Seattle. Obviously, population differs as well, but we do have a lot of land here. There is sort of more places to go, if you will. And we're also not, we're not locked in by a body of water. So there is room to sprawl and there is room to, build outward.
So, Audrey, we talked about Austin's approach, building a lot very quickly, and then rents can either drop or stabilize depending on the demand. Do you see any downsides to the way that Austin did things?
Absolutely. I think there's been a lot of concern about redevelopment. So, someone buying an older, therefore cheaper apartment building to turn it into something new, and renters are forced to leave, and they may not be able to find something similar within the city. We've actually, and this I can't fully explain, but we've actually seen eviction filing rates go up in the city as rent prices have gone down. I'm not entirely sure why that is. The state of Texas does not allow for the same kind of tenant protections that other cities and other states have. So the city of Austin has put in place some to kind of to curb, like I said, this issue of developers buying old apartment buildings and then pushing low income renters out. But we just don't kind of have the sort of renter protection infrastructure, in part because it's just not allowed by state law. The other thing, too, that a lot of folks have brought up is this question of, okay, we're building more. What does that mean for our roads? What does that mean for our water system? We do have significant environmental protections here in Austin. We have a lot of waterways. People love to be outside. It's beautiful many months out of the year. And so I do think people worry at the same time, are we sort of eroding what people love about this city while, just sort of building to address this demand that we've had for housing?
Yeah, I've heard some of those same things here in Seattle, but, Austin and the changes it's gone through, I imagine it's just more intense there. So, Audrey, do you think this drop in rents is going to last?
I do not.
Why?
Well, first off, we're already seeing the percentage drop slow. So we're already seeing kind of the height, I would say, of this drop kind of taper off. And it's really, like I said earlier, the market doing what the market does. It likes to make money. People like to make money. And so in the same way that builders responded to this incredible demand of people moving here during the pandemic, they are also responding to rent prices going down. That makes financing a lot harder if you can't say to investors, oh, look, here's the income I can promise you. Those promises aren't there right now. And so, like I said, building has significantly slowed. And I don't think, and when I talk to experts about this, they say this as well, they don't think that's going to change until rent prices start going up again.
In some ways, that's the key to bringing rents down, is like, how long can you sustain this construction so that rents don't necessarily have to jump up again so that builders want to build more stuff? Is there a way to break or at least even out this cycle?
Yeah, it's quite a conundrum, right? Because there's a demand for housing, so rent prices go up. There's money to be made, so people start building. Then rent prices go down. There's less money to be made, so people stop building. Then rent prices go up, right? It's sort of this constant, as you're saying, this constant boom and bust. How do we break that? So I think there's potentially 2 answers, when I talk to people about this. And one thing that I've heard is, maybe on sort of this downturn, like, for example, I said the building has significantly slowed in Austin because interest rates are high. There's not as much money to be made because rents are falling. Maybe now's the time that institutions, whether that be governments or nonprofits, step in and provide financing for builders, make it profitable for them to continue to build. I think the other answer is probably, which we see in other countries, government-owned housing that is insulated from these market changes. I'm not sure there's the political will in the US to fund that, but that certainly could be an answer to sort of this back and forth boom and bust that we may see in some cities.
Fascinating. Well, thanks, Audrey. This is great.
Thanks so much, Joshua.
That's it for Booming. Thanks so much for listening. We have a request for you listeners. If you live in the Seattle area, you may have noticed that it's gotten pretty darn expensive here. We want to know what your economic hacks are for getting by in a city that has such a high cost of living. Give us a call at 206-221-7158 and leave a voicemail with your hacks. It could be featured in an upcoming episode. You can also email us at booming@kuow.org. Thanks to those of you who have donated to the show. We really appreciate your support. If you want to donate, go to kuow.org/booming. And thanks. Our producers are Lucy Suchek and Alec Cowan. Booming is hosted by me, Joshua McNichols, and Monica Nicholsberg. Our editor is Carol Smith. We'll see you next week.
I'm a firm believer that nature is healing. In these chaotic times, I invite you to take a breath and reconnect with our natural world. Wow, right in front of us. I'm Chris Morgan. Join me on The Wild as we explore stories of hope and resilience in nature. We'll bring you up close to some extraordinary species and learn how they are finding ways to adapt and thrive in fast-changing environments. Listen to The Wild on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.